The panel is titled, When Millions Are Spent and No Infrastructure is Left Behind. And it's basically, why is the cost of running for public office outpacing development of progressive civic infrastructure? Why do national Democrats routinely spend millions of dollars every 4 years in some states, but leave little, if any, long-term progressive infrastructure behind? Our panelists today will share lessons that they've learned from their campaigns and opportunities they see to build in-state infrastructure that's inclusive and representative of their communities. The genesis of this panel really came from our speakers, who I've gotten to know through my work on SiriusXM Progress Channel. And all of them, in the wake of the 2020 elections, I just kind of keep an eye for what they say, had made remarks or interviews about what happened in their states. We have with us today North Carolina State Representative Ricky Hurtado, who represents House District 63 in Alamance County. This is Ricky's first term. He won in November. Alamance County is not an easy county. North Carolina, we all watch it. It was one of the most expensive Senate races, United States Senate races, over 100 million spent on each side, plus tens of millions spent on the presidential race. Florida State Representative Anna Eskamani, who represents House District 47 in the Orlando area. I have to tell you guys, you all know the literally hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars that were spent in Florida by Democrats and their allies. And that's been a pattern every 4 years for decades as well. Along the way, even though Biden lost Florida, Florida passed an increase in the minimum wage to $15 with over 60% of the vote. Anna Eskamani has some real thoughts on this. And also joining us, J.D. Schulten. J.D. ran for Congress twice in Iowa's 4th CD, up in the northwest corner of that state, a very rural, very conservative district. He almost beat Steve King in 2018. He is now the director of Rural Vote PAC. In the Democratic caucuses alone, over $60 million was spent on TV in 2020. Tens of millions were spent in the fall as well. Our panelists today are going to be able to talk to you about what they see in their states and what we can learn and what they're doing now, which is the most exciting part to me. Let's start with Representative Ricky Hurtado. Ricky, introduce yourself and tell people what you're doing in North Carolina.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much, Joe, sorry. Can you hear me okay? Thumbs up?
Yep.
Perfect. Well, thanks so much, Joe. We were just commenting earlier, right? Like, we live in an age where many of us are seeing each other for the first time because so many of these conversations have taken place over the phone and in your case on the radio, right? And so thanks so much for bringing this topic together, a very timely and critical topic. As you mentioned, I'm State Representative Ricky Hurtado in District 63, which is in Alamance County. For folks that know North Carolina, it is in between the Triad and the Triangle. So I have Greensboro and a civil rights history to the west, and we have Duke and Carolina State and the Research Triangle Park to my east. And we are that landmass in the middle that connects those two parts of the world. I wouldn't be so dressed up today for this panel, but I have the great fortune of being part of the only state in the nation that still does not have a budget, I believe. And so we're still in session and still working every day and just getting home from some votes. As Joe mentioned, Alamance County was not an easy county to win by any stretch of the imagination. We had a rough year in North Carolina in 2020, as many battleground states did. It was a close race for Biden, losing out just by a few percentage points. And we saw Democrats across the board lose. I was one of two state legislators to be able to flip a seat from red to blue. And that took on a special, even more special significance in Alamance County, given the historic nature of my own campaign. And so we've never had a Latino or Latinx Democrat ever win in a competitive statewide race in North Carolina in the history of the state, and didn't have any other Latinos really on any other level competing in a competitive battleground district across North Carolina. And this was coming in a place like Alamance County, where it has a history of conservative politics, but most importantly, a history of anti-immigrant and anti-Latino rhetoric that really created an environment where the moment that I announced that I was going to run for office, doubt started to seep both, not just in Republicans' minds, but in Democrats as well. Can a young 30-something Latino actually win a district that is this competitive in North Carolina? And so much of our focus for the 2020 election, pre-COVID and during COVID, was a field game, an effective field game that, through the support of folks from across, not just North Carolina, but across the nation, really allowed us to have one-on-one conversations, either over the phone or at people's doors, to talk about what was on their mind. And for me, to really begin to rebuild trust in and rebuild the civic fabric of a community that continues to feel broken in many ways as it continues to try to wade through misinformation and through COVID-19 social isolation. And so we saw, as Joe mentioned, right, millions of dollars be poured into North Carolina, and the state legislator races also felt that as well. I think what's so important now is, in the wake of these victories, so much of this enthusiasm stayed in the community. People were ready to see what was next. They recognized that Democrats didn't win across the board, but they knew that we had an opportunity to defy the odds and what it meant for Alamance County to actually now be a part of a coalition of folks that are thinking about not the past, but the future. And so what we've been doing is really capitalize on that momentum. And there's both opportunity and joy and optimism, but also a lot of frustration on my part as to where that's taken us. We had a wide network of volunteers and organizations who were still invested in making sure we were pushing Alamance County in the positive direction. And so this same network of folks who phone banked and canvassed were now at the front lines of making sure we were getting information out for COVID-19 vaccine and making sure that our neighbors knew where to turn to for support. We made hundreds of calls in the first few weeks as we were going through different groups of when the vaccine could be distributed in the community, to make appointments for folks, to make sure that they were in the know of where to go and how to go about all that information. And more than anything, let them know that there was an infrastructure of support for folks to be able to turn to for help. We've been doing it on a number of different issues as well, to make sure that we maintain a 24/7 constant presence in the community. So we, quite frankly, never stopped canvassing and never stopped phone banking after the election. And I think that infrastructure is so critical. And I brought up frustration. For me, where the frustration came for me is that we recognize the effort and the reach that we have as a one state legislator campaign, one person in a county, and the wide reach that we have. And what's frustrating is understanding the potential reach that they could have if the same partners that came to our state, the same partners that were working alongside us to get us elected, continue building this infrastructure in the community to make sure that we're continuing to build on this movement and on this victory that we had in Alamance County. And so I could go on and on about the new playbook that we're building here in North Carolina to make sure that through these infrastructure building, not just in our county, but across the state, we are rebuilding trust in our communities and making sure that folks know that we have their back and we're fighting for them in Raleigh here in North Carolina. So excited to continue having this conversation with you, Joe, but I'll let some of the other folks on this panel chime in here on this question.
Great. And we will want to hear more about that new playbook. Up next is someone I got to meet in 2018 when she was running for the first time for the state legislature in Florida. And after the election, I saw an interview that Representative Escamani did with my pal, Jordan Zakaran, at Progressives Everywhere. And I thought it just resonated with me so much, the frustrations and what needed to be learned. So I am so glad that our audience today here at Netroots gets to meet Representative Anna Escamani from House District 47. Welcome, Anna. It's nice to see you in person.
You too, Joe. It's such a pleasure. Thanks so much for having me today and for putting together this awesome panel. And I'm just like nodding my head, listening to Ricky and some of the work that he's doing and some of his perspectives, because I think we could learn a lot of the same lessons in Florida. So again, my name is Anna Escamani, and I'm proud to serve District 47, the state legislature in the Sunshine State. I am an Orlando local, born and raised. I'm the daughter of working class immigrants, and I come to this work with clear eyes and a full heart, because I know that Democrats can win in states like Florida, but we have to go beyond the status quo and how we organize and how we also finance infrastructure, because as the core of this conversation centers on is that we spend a lot of money on elections, but it's very transactional. And as soon as that Tuesday, November comes and goes, there is an aftermath of just a barren wasteland of people who don't have jobs anymore, of folks that didn't learn long-term organizing skills, but just kind of learned the basics for a GOTV operation. And of course, a whole lot of folks who are disenchanted if you didn't win. And one of the struggles we have in Florida too is just a basic progressive pipeline. And I'll tell you, I was talking to an individual that works within the Florida legislature on the staff committee side, and she doesn't work in the legislature anymore, but she talks about how Republicans in Florida are very good of taking care of their people. Because if you're a young college student looking for a Democratic leaning or a progressive internship program in Florida, one that is paid, for example, it's very hard to do that. But if you're a Republican, you got so many opportunities as a young conservative. You can intern with the governor's office. You can intern with lawmakers. You can hop on a campaign that actually has enough resources to pay their interns with a stipend. And so we don't even take care of our people as much as the opposition does. And not only is that just morally not appropriate, but we can't train people that way, right? And I take a lot of pride where I am in Central Florida. We've always invested in young people. We've always invested in building a pipeline. And if I can't provide a stipend because of my financial limitations, I at the very least make sure there's no cost barriers to getting involved. I'll offset any types of travel expenses or food expenses just to make sure this young person can actually get an experience where they're not going to be in the hole because they want to get involved in politics. And indeed, whenever campaigns are hiring in Central Florida, they always find good people because we're building that pipeline. So what does that look like compared to what we've seen, right? So Florida obviously attracts a lot of donors, and money was not an issue in 2020 for us. I mean, millions of dollars came into Florida, even for state house races. But the targeting was definitely very wide. And if I had saw this list of who's being targeted, I probably could have provided feedback to whatever C4 or PAC was doing it, and that, of course, provide feedback on legal lines, because sometimes we're also prevented by firewalls. But I will say that even the targeting coming from outside groups was just very, very broad, where some of the seats they thought they could flip, I knew just by the political geography of it, it's a very hard ask. Just despite how much money you have, it can still be hard to flip some of these seats. And then I think what makes it even more difficult is how late the money comes in. The money comes in 2 months before November. Most of it gets spent on television ads, and the videos that are produced are very cut and paste. So in the case of 2020, there were a series of campaign ads that were produced for different Democratic candidates, and they were all about healthcare. And it was basically cut and paste. It was attacking the opponent, the Republican incumbent, and it was the same healthcare issue. They just put a different face, different name. So that's also very transactional, right? Because that's a clear example of not talking to the voters in that district. You're just trying to quickly produce content that you think is going to sway a generic NPA or a generic moderate Republican, but none of it's customized. Like, none of it feels very local. And at the same time, we're not being proactive in sharing our vision for the state of Florida. So if you're only going on the negative and not uplifting the stories of our amazing candidates and what their plans are and their visions are, then again, not only are we short selling ourselves, but we're not uplifting the brand of that candidate that might run for office again, right? And maybe they didn't win the first time, but if we do our part to at least uplift their brand and who they are, we're going to be even more well-positioned to try running again. And the last thing I'll say before tossing it back into the space is that so much money is raised and spent, even when you know you're going to lose. And I'll never understand this, especially in states where you continue getting these like very panic driven emails, the DNC or the DSCC. And it's like clearly this race is not going to turn out the way that we want it to. And yet these major institutions keep raising money because they know that the sense of urgency can drive donors. And what's frustrating is that so all this big money will go to these statewide races. Meanwhile, at a local level, for candidates that are on the ground who get to know their constituents, we operate with very limited resources. And we're typically on the ground a lot earlier than these other larger races are too. Because I'll tell you, my campaigns, when we flipped our seat in 2018, we left it all on the field. We knocked on 40,000 doors. And we did that because we started a year early, right? So to have a good field program, it has to be consistent. It can't just show up 2 months before election day, which is why we need to be raising money for local races and raising money for base building organizations, not in October, but right now. And I'm proud to say that some of our efforts are mimicking that advice. We've launched our own voter registration organization called People Power for Florida. We're raising money into it. We're leading on hiring organizing fellows to lead on voter registration on their college campuses. In addition to leading the charge on voter engagement, I also do what I can as an elected official to lead the charge on voter empowerment and education. Because I do think that a lot of voters don't even realize who their state elected official is. They don't realize the impact that state government has on their lives. And if there's one thing COVID-19 demonstrated to us is that local leadership matters, whether it's our mayors or it's our governors or it's state house reps like myself. We've helped more than 45,000 people in Florida with their unemployment claims. And we did that as state lawmakers. And so to not only invest in your people and to invest early in the organizations that are building infrastructure on the ground that don't disappear after November, but stay after November, alongside us who are in positions of elected office to use that bully pulpit, not just to focus on our bills, but to actually focus on voter education long term so that an everyday voter knows how important the state legislature is, not because I'm there, but because of the institution and how it impacts your daily life.
Wow. Work you're doing so exciting. I've been following it. And I think both you and Ricky made very clear just the importance of state legislative races, which I often feel like people in the national organizations don't completely grasp as much, but we can talk about that more. I want to get to our third panelist, someone I got to know back in 2018 when he was fighting one of the most evil people in America, Steve King. J.D. Schulten came back home to Iowa, drove around in his RV, met voters, came so close in 2018, ran in 2020, which by then Republicans had figured out they needed to get rid of Steve King, so it was a different race. And shortly after the election, JD did an interview with the Iowa starting line that, again, it was one of those interviews. I read it and I thought, absolutely right. And it was about the need for year-round organizing in his state. JD is continuing his work. And I want to turn it over to him to talk about that and some of the lessons he's learned along the way too.
Well, thank you so much, Joe. And it's an honor to be here just with a great panelist here. So I was a lot of things that I'm working on now with I'm the executive director for ruralvote.org is things that I saw from the 2 times running and just the gaps. I see Iowa is in this weird moment right now where we voted for Obama twice and then we drastically shifted right and went for Trump twice. And so we're politically, well, first of all, we're geographically between Wisconsin and Nebraska and South Dakota. I think politically we're in the same place and we have a pivotal moment right now to figure out where we're going to be. And that really, I see how campaigns are run right now. And to me, it just doesn't make sense how we're doing a lot of these things. And it doesn't seem like money's an issue. I think every person for federal office who was a Democrat in Iowa last year, so 4 congressional races in the Senate race, all outraised their opponents. But yet we only have 1 congressional seat that won. And so You think about all the money that came in during the caucus and with the party and everything. It's just like, I'm very curious on doing an audit or something like that and saying, okay, after all this money came into the state with all these campaigns, what do we have left? Do we have better data? Because in my race, because it wasn't organized for several years beforehand, we had 60,000 independent voters that we just had no contact for or no information for. And so, and I look back to our 2018 race, and we ended up moving the needle 24 points. We lost by 3. But if we had started from a closer place, could we have won? I don't know, and I'm not blaming it on anything. It's one of those things where you look back and see we rely so much on campaigns. And it's just, we need to break a model. We need to have a winning strategy on how we're doing this, especially as we see the drift towards republicanism here in the state. We need to figure out a counterbalance, and what we're doing right now is not making any sense. And so there's a couple things that I'm really trying to challenge folks with. We rely way too much on campaigns. They organize usually from about, at best, July of election year to November. We need to be doing that more year round, and we need to be working with groups to do that more year round. Also, when we have campaigns that are done, like my campaign, where does all that data go? Where does all that information go? And we just leave that out there. And I feel like the party really needs to improve on collecting all that data. Even, it doesn't matter if it's a state house race, state senate race. There's so much information and vital information that is there. We need to be picking that up and finding that a better way. But then you also go back to candidates. On how we're going about races. Who do candidates talk to the most? And what I've seen from the federal side is it's donors number 1 and it's consultants number 2. We need to be talking to people. And just as we talk about how trickle-down economics is awful for this country, trickle-down politics is not doing us any favors right now either. And so in places like where I am, we're that other district in Iowa. There's 4 congressional districts, and we're the one that has 70,000 more registered Republicans than Democrats. And so it's one of those things is, are we going to be here? Are we going to win here? And it's not an easy race, but in order to win statewide in Iowa, we absolutely have to do better here in the 4th district. And so that's my really challenge. And that's what I'm focused on with ruralvote.org. We're more than just Iowa. We're going to be in battleground states across the nation, focusing on the rural vote and trying to lose less initially before we can have success. And hopefully by losing less in certain areas, we have an opportunity to win statewide races here in the midterm.
Thanks, JD. And I think you've heard each of our 3 panelists speak, and the themes are so similar. And these are all, every state's important, every race is important, but these are 3 states that we have all watched up close from a national perspective: Iowa, North Carolina, and Florida. If you have questions, place your questions in the chat. Obviously, we want to take questions from the audience. I want to actually, as the moderator, play as small a role as possible. So I'll ask a question now just to get a conversation going. And also, Anna, Ricky, and JD, feel free to ask each other questions, because as you heard the other speak, I'm sure it just triggered a lot of ideas. But let me just start with you, Ricky. You mentioned the new playbook in North Carolina. Flesh that out a little bit and tell us what you meant by that.
Yeah, I think JD and Anna fleshed it out plenty well. I think it's a new mindset, right? I think we understand the fundamentals of what it takes to win in our communities. But for some reason, once we get towards election time, we begin ignoring those fundamentals. And if we want to be a party, a big tent party, a party focused on the people, then we have to make sure that we are communicating effectively with those people beyond July to November, as JD mentioned, right? There is a gap in communication and this huge premium on trust right now. And so in order for us to be able to effectively get our message out during early voting or get out the vote time in any given election, we need to start communicating with those constituents, with those residents in our communities 12, 18 months before that. And so that's why I have found that it's so important to communicate effectively in a time where, due to COVID and social isolation, and a time where people aren't sure what they're seeing on social media is true or fake, those conversations, those phone calls matter so much more than they ever did before. And that's what I see. This isn't just speculation. This is what I hear when I get feedback from constituents. It's not about the piece that they read in the newspaper about a vote that I took. It's not about a shiny mailer that they've received on my behalf during the campaign or any communication after. It is about a human touch that they've received with a volunteer, with a canvas stop from our team, or from communication that received from me in some way, shape, or form. And so I think for me, that new playbook isn't necessarily all new, but it's a new emphasis on what it means to build that beloved community in competitive districts across North Carolina. And that matters so much here in North Carolina because we are a state that wins by razor-thin margins. Governor Cooper just won by not so big of a margin this year, but even thinner margin in 2016, 10,000 votes, I believe. Our Attorney General just went through the same thing. And so whenever these races can swing by so much, one of the Senate candidates running for Senate here in North Carolina lost by less than 500 votes, Sherry Beasley. And so you can see how maintaining this constant presence, and obviously I'm biased, but I do believe state legislators are at the front lines of this, right? They are large enough to get a message out, but not big enough to really have a huge impact across the state. And so I do believe those are your frontline members that can serve as so much of that infrastructure that connects the grassroots to statewide campaigns as well.
Well, that's great. Thank you. And Anna, I'm really interested. You mentioned People Power Florida, which everyone should follow. And see the work you're doing. What I'm intrigued by is how, knowing there has been this void in your state, and Jia Dunn, who I think is in Tampa, mentioned that he runs a C3 nonpartisan student voter registration, and it's just been difficult to keep organizers funded and on the ground all year round. So, which is an example of the work that needs to be done and not being funded. How is what you're doing being received in Florida Democratic politics?
Yeah,
the people who haven't been doing it.
Yeah, it's a really great question, Joe. I mean, we've seen in Florida a kind of a decentralization of a lot of these organizing efforts because folks just haven't seen it coming from the Democratic Party. Now, maybe this cycle, it will be different. The Democratic Party in Florida has brought on one of my very good friends and colleagues, Representative Angie Nixon, to lead their field operations. I know FDP here in Florida does have some voter reg operations already happening, which is very positive to see. But I will say that the funding for it is challenging. And I'm not the only person leading the effort. We have different organizations like Equal Ground, Mi Vecino, Local Power, Florida Ground Game, like all these new orgs have really blossomed to help with this effort because we know there's plenty of registration efforts to go around, but B, we have to build relationships with our communities. And it's really important that we create space for Latino focused organizations to work in building trust relationships with Spanish speaking audiences. Same thing with Black led organizations. And we often really focus heavily on student groups because our program is very much grounded in organizing fellowships. And so we have a lot of young people on our team, and they are college students or have really great connections to college environments. And so each one of us kind of, tries to fulfill an area that we know we're good at, and we can build power in that way. But we operate with very limited resources. I'll tell you that it was announced last week that Governor Ron DeSantis, Florida's governor, has put $2 million towards Republican voter registration. And the voter reg gap in Florida has gotten smaller and smaller. It used to be 10 years ago, 200,000 more Democrats registered than Republicans. Now it's 20,000. And so we are essentially trying to not only redeem our strength, but we have to be thoughtful to our education efforts and appealing to NPAs. Because I do think that my race, as an example, I would not have won my election if it wasn't because we talked to no party affiliation voters. So it can't just be an arms race on who has more voter reg forms than someone else. It also has to be focused on our values and focused on the issues that we know everyday people care about, no matter what their political affiliation is. In District 47, where I represent, we won 2 precincts that voted for President Trump. So 2 precincts in my district that went to Trump went to me. And I am a very out loud and proud Democrat and, care about working class people. But I also, in that same regard, call out corporate greed. I challenge corporations. I don't make money from corporations. And a lot of the folks that found Trump to be appealing, that's what they're interested in. They're interested in a candidate that challenges status quo, that isn't shy to make a point or to call out industries that historically Democrats have also benefited from because they accept donations from industries like fossil fuel companies. In my case, the theme parks are a very powerful force. I do not take money from the theme parks. I don't go to their special receptions. And so it's also about our values. Like, who are we, as Democrats, and how does that also inspire people to support us?
Really? Wow. That's great. Thank you for that. I want to,
Joe, do you mind if I ask them a question?
Please do. I love that.
Okay. So I'm very interested, since you're in Florida and since you're in North Carolina. Here, I feel in Iowa, we are, especially in the rural communities, are at the front edge of mis and disinformation. It's very prevalent right now with what Facebook, the hearings going on this week. And so I guess my question to Representative Hurtado, how did you get your message out there when you had so much money being thrown at races, at federal races, at the presidential race, and then also for Representative Escamani, just kind of talk about mis and disinformation on that. But first, Representative Hurtado.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think part of what we benefited from in the 2020 election is by the time they ran their, quite effective, as they usually are, mis and disinformation campaigns against candidates like me, often, racially tinged campaigns, right? Attacks against people like me. We had built an infrastructure strong enough that you began to see people pop up and say, wait, I've met that guy. Like, that's not who they're talking about. Or actually, you can just call him. A big thing that became conversation in my district was that everyone has my phone number. And so you can go to our website and people are shocked that when they call me, it's usually me that picks up. And so I think it's those little things that have built up over time that allow people to say, well, that's not Ricky. Or if you actually have that concern about Ricky, you can just call him and ask him yourself. And so that, I think, has helped build a message, a movement, and a brand that allows folks to cut through the disinformation, or at least know where they can go to the primary source to debate whether this is real or fake. And so, it's not easy. It takes a lot of effort. But I think that is sort of my point with a lot of what I'm talking about tonight, is that I find it really hard to combat a fake social media post with another social media post. It just becomes all noise on the internet, or a campaign ad on TV, right? It's all sort of getting really jumbled on the air. And so for me, it is building those relationships in the community and an organizing mentality that is the only way that we're going to get out of this mess right now.
And I'll just add to that too. So we see a lot of disinformation, misinformation, especially among our Spanish language communities and our Haitian speaking communities. And a lot of it travels through platforms like WhatsApp and different mediums that many of our immigrant-based or multilingual communities utilize to talk to their loved ones. And there's been a lot of good research out there that has shown, as was just mentioned, it's very hard to compete with misinformation in the sense of responding to every false point. And what has been more effective is to share your accurate perspectives, but do so where you're reaching more people. And that's where I do think that not only, of course, is investment in digital advertising and digital targeting really important, but field is where it's at. Because I'll tell you, my very first campaign, I had more than 25 pieces of negative mail used against me, 3 negative TV commercials, and multiple, you know, other slanderous attempts to hurt me, my image, my message. But when that started, it was probably September of 2018, and we have been campaigning since July of 2017, and we had been knocking on doors since September of 2017. So when these attack ads and mail started going out, we had already established a lot of trust with our district, and folks knew to call out the bullshit. They knew it wasn't true. So I think a lot of it also ties to what are we doing to build these long-term relationships with our constituents and with, in my case, Floridians. And it doesn't just take shape on the campaign trail. Throughout COVID-19, my office, as I mentioned earlier, we've been championing basic public services. So unemployment, trying to get people to cut through the bureaucracy and the broken system of unemployment and get benefits to them. Small business relief, trying to help small businesses not only access programs like PPP, but also get through the state agencies that create different bureaucratic layers. I just helped one of my small businesses who was waiting for a license to get it approved overnight. So you also have to use the bully pulpit that you have, even in a place where we're in the minority, like in Florida, to positively impact people's lives. Because at the end of the day, a lot of folks operate under their self-interest. You can see that when it comes to an issue like the $15 minimum wage in Florida. Despite Florida going for President Trump in 2020, we passed a ballot amendment that was to increase the minimum wage in Florida to $15 by 2026. And the minimum wage just went up to $10 last week because of this ballot amendment. Voters approved this with more than 60% of support. So that tells me that A, populist progressive issues can win if we actually champion them. And B, folks are voting for their self-interest. You know, folks voted for a $15 minimum wage because it impacts their pocketbooks or the pocketbooks of people around them that they care about. So what are we doing as advocates to appeal to someone's self-interest, but to help that self-interest connect to a collective good? Some people probably voted for it, like myself, because of the collective good. Like, I want to see more people they get more money because they work hard and they're living on the edge and they deserve to be paid better. So some of us approach it with an altruistic lens, but majority voters are just thinking, how does this impact me and my life and the people that I care about? So what can we do to make the connection between self-interest and collective liberation, self-interest and collective good? And that's my advice to strategists out there. And of course, we have way too many consultants that make money off the process that are just not good strategists to begin with. And they maintain a presence in Democratic politics because of their relationships. And I think we have to be very critical that you know, to remember that consultants win whether we win or lose, because they get paid at the end of the day. And so this isn't to shit on like every consultant out there. I have many friends who are consultants, but we also get into this habit of like giving the same people the benefit of the doubt, even though they work with corporate interest and they don't have a huge win record anymore. And we have to be critical about that, because we don't have, like, we only have a finite amount of resources and days to change the world. At least for my life, that's how I feel. And so we have to make sure we're working with the people that replicate the same values that I replicate, but also have a commitment to transformational change versus transactional politics. And way too many consultants just practice transactional politics, and that feeds into this 2-year cycle we're talking about.
That last part is so important. JD mentioned it too, and I remember having conversations with JD about his race in 2018 and the advice he got from consultants that didn't comport with what he was hearing on the ground on key issues. And it's about it. One theme that is coming across from all three of you is running your campaigns at a local level and trusting the people at the local level who understand their districts and understand their constituents, and not having the campaigns be dictated in a cookie cutter way from people in Washington or, you know, Tallahassee or Raleigh or wherever. JD, I just want to follow up because I mean, I imagine what Anna said there kind of resonated a little bit with you.
Absolutely, and sorry to do the question, but Bard, I was just so curious. But that's Anna's 100% right on this, and I just remembered when I first started, I had somebody who asked me, it was like, hey, who are your consultants? And like when you run for federal office, one of the first things you do, you apply for being endorsed by different groups, and one of the first questions is, who are your consultants? And I always thought that was so weird. And now I understand why, because if you have a certain consultant, then you're viable or something like that. But one of the main issues I ran on was antitrust. And I didn't learn that from a consultant or polling or anything. What I did was got in my car and just went around and just started talking to folks and seeing towns. We're a very rural district here, and going to towns that have just been depleted in the last 20, 40 years, and just talking with folks. And they're like, well, there used to be 2 seed dealers here. Now there's one, but it's 20 miles away. And so it just resonated. To me, I don't want somebody from DC telling me how to run this race. I know my folks around here. I know why they skew towards Republicans, but I've also know how I can talk to them too. Like my neighbor, Caucus for Trump, has a truck the size of Texas and 5 AR-15s. You would think that we would have not much in common. Over 80% of the stuff we relate on things. And so, I mean, there's rabbit holes that will go down, but to me, that is I think part of the huge problem is we have a consultant class problem in the Democratic Party, and we need to be honest about it.
Really important. Now, Ricky, I know you're in session. You have to leave at in just a few minutes. So I wanted to just give you a few minutes. I do want to also suggest, if anyone read the assemblync.com, an article titled "A New Democratic Playbook," an interview with Ricky Hurtado that is just terrific. But just some parting thoughts, Representative Hurtado.
Yeah, no, thank you, Joe. Just huge snaps for Anna and JD right now. Everything that they were saying, certainly applicable here in North Carolina. I also want to lift up, I've focused obviously today talking about my county, my campaign, and sort of our own efforts. But like I said, I'm one person, and people recognize across the state the need to build this infrastructure. So looking at leaders that won and lost in the last election, folks, and organizations that are springing up, similar to in Florida, we have a growing Latino infrastructure here, recognizing how critical their voice and their vote is going to be in the next 10 years. And quite frankly, for the rest of the history of North Carolina, Poder and C doing great work with Eden and Godinez in North Carolina, a candidate that ran and lost, but just inspired so many people. Amy Steele now launching the new North Carolina project to really, as an ode to the great organizing work in Georgia with the new Georgia project. So a lot of exciting things happening in North Carolina right now. And I think that's what gives me hope, even in the face of redistricting, even in the face of a tough loss in 2020. We are taking lessons learned and investing in the infrastructure for long-term gain in North Carolina. So, stay invested in this place, because I think we're going to be making some noise here in 2022.
I want to just get off mute. Wow, I'm just so glad Ricky could join us. And if you get a second, check out that article on the Assembly NC. One thing that both Anna and JD have talked about, and I'm particularly interested in, I worked in the gun violence prevention movement back in the 90s, and 2 of our best wins were referenda in Florida, 1984, passing a 3-day handgun waiting period, 84-16, passing gun show loopholes in 1998, 72-28. You mentioned those are huge wins in a state that the NRA, Marion Hammer, controlled, the NRA's top lobbyist. You mentioned the minimum wage. We also had Amendment 4 on voting rights restoration in 2018 that passed with 64% of the vote. How do we go from getting, and JD, I'd like your thoughts on this too. How do we go from getting people who agree with us on policies to agreeing with us on politics. You want to take a shot, Anna?
I definitely can. So we have to meet people where they're at, belly to belly. And this is why, again, I cannot stress enough the importance of field, but also continuously building trust with your community 24/7. In the case of our work in District 47, we don't just show up when it's election season. We show up every single day. So I am always out in our community, and even during the pandemic, when we were unable to have the same type of in-person town hall or gatherings we used to have, we just replicated it on a digital platform. But the same organizing skills you use to get people to come out to a phone bank, or for people to take action with you by signing up to vote by mail, we use those same tactics in the legislative cycle. We use those same tactics when trying to get out eviction diversion information to people, right? Like you put together issues or services that people need. Again, back to my point about self-interest, but then you tie it to the collective good. So for example, we've done a lot of work throughout this pandemic in rental assistance and eviction diversion. And so leveraging, in our case, mostly federal programs, because the state of Florida has really not done a lot on these issues, but hosting workshops, providing interpreters in Spanish and Creole. So the services can also be made available to folks who have different language justice needs. And we also make sure we have ASL or closed captioning. So there's a lot of efforts you have to take to create an environment where every person, no matter their ability or their language, can also tap in and learn about these resources. And then you use that space to invite others that are directly impacted or other folks who are expert voices. And all of a sudden you've created a platform where if somebody's looking for information about preventing eviction for themselves, they can tune in and learn. Doesn't matter their political affiliation. Nothing in this event is designed to be partisan or even election driven. But throughout the event, we are expressing our values. I don't think it's appropriate that someone gets evicted in the middle of a pandemic. You can call that a democratic position if you want, but I think it's a human position, right? And we know time and time again that progressive issues win when we actually slow down to talk about them and educate people on them. I'll give you one more example. So this week, I was invited to speak at one of our local chambers. So we have several chambers in Florida. We have a big chamber that's like very, very political and big business oriented. Then we have our local chambers that they're still big business influence, but they also ground themselves in smaller businesses and community initiatives. So I was invited alongside one of my other Democratic colleagues and other local elected officials to do what they called a reverse hobnob. So we were supposed to pitch an idea to the chamber, and they were going to vote for their favorite ideas, right? And as someone who's very busy, I didn't have a lot of time to come up with a new topic. So I said, all right, well, I'm just going to talk about closing corporate tax loopholes with a policy called combined reporting, which is like super nerdy. And also, of course, like leans a little bit left type, because most people assume if you talk about corporate accountability, you're probably not a Republican. Long story short, go to this event. I pitched this idea to 7 different tables of chamber members. They vote for their favorites. The top 2 were me and the other Democrat, Representative Carlos Smith. He was number 1. And his issue was accountability for nursing homes so that we pay our nursing home workers better. And mine was closing corporate tax loopholes. So 2 of the most, I'd probably argue, lefty issues, right? Like issues folks would assume are progressively minded, won the support of one of our local chambers. And if we didn't take the time to show up in that environment, to be authentic, to share the concept and give examples, this space would never even realize that these were policy concerns that were real and that we could solve. So I think a part of it's also being very intentional and actually having conversations, even with audiences that you assume don't agree, because your assumption might be totally wrong. And that is a relationship, because now, as I work on this initiative in the legislature, not only am I going to be able to talk about my conversations with the East Orlando Chamber, but hopefully when they read about it in the paper or see it on the news, they'll continue spreading the word as well. So it doesn't happen overnight, but it does happen with this consistent persistence for something greater than ourselves, and about meeting people where they're at, belly to belly, and not being afraid to have the wonky policy conversation, because chances are the voter actually wants to engage with you on that level. We just listen to consultants who tell us that everything has to be a bumper sticker, and thus we don't actually build relationships with people. We just treat them like they're votes on a board versus they're actual humans with lives.
I love that story so much. And I love Carlos Smith too. He is terrific. Um, uh, JD, just following up on this, when I think of, the states that have passed Medicaid expansion or marijuana legalization, some really red states, and others, Missouri just did it last summer on an off election, which is usually worse for progressives, on Medicaid expansion. Oklahoma did Medicaid expansion. Again, it reminds me of what you said in the beginning too, that you have to go in. Part of going into rural areas and finding voters who agree with you is to make sure they know that you're there, that you talk to them, and you may not win the district, but you're upping the vote statewide and helping it win. So how do you make sure that voters who are going to vote for those kind of policies understand that it's tied to politics too?
I think that's one of the biggest questions we're seeing in the Democratic Party, and our policies are extremely popular. I mean, workers' rights in Missouri as well, and all of these things happening in ruby red areas. Excuse me. In fact, we did this poll a few months ago that we just wanted to show in rural battleground states in 8 different states, what is the Democratic brand? How bad is it right now? And we had a generic candidate that we thought would be really good, and then we had a candidate who's from the coast, multimillionaire who just wants to cut taxes for the super wealthy. And the generic candidate wins by 35%. Put a D by that person's name, they lose by 1. And that's how bad the Democratic brand right now. And then when you have policies extremely popular, you put a D by it, it drops 10-15% immediately. And so that's what we're seeing right now, is this disconnect. And to me, it goes back to how I view, especially in this district, a county like Carroll County that voted for Obama in 2008 and then voted almost 70% for Trump in 2020. And you look at the difference from 2008 to 2020 in a county like Carroll County, it is mis and disinformation. And where's our counter to that? Because like right now, where I live, my state rep, my state senator, my member of Congress, my governor, and both senators, all Republicans. We need to counter that. And I think going back to something Representative Escamani said was she talked about we don't invest in the next generation or in building our bench and different things like that. That's something that, like, we have people who are working their tails off in these state house races that don't have a shot here in Western Iowa, and for what though? And like, will we get them again? Like, they stepped up recently because they saw the rise of Trumpism and they said that's not us. And I give them all so much credit for doing what they're doing. But we as a party need to be more strategic about this. The more we have candidates talking about Democratic policies, the better we are going to be off. But we need to support them, and that's, I think, a huge thing that I see as being a blueberry in a bowl of tomato soup. And there's a lot of us around here that we're it's. Are we going to win every race? No, but at the end of the day, like in 2018, I saw just if you had a little bit of infrastructure to start with, how much you could go. And that's I feel something that the party needs to figure out. But it's also, I always challenge folks that we are the party. We can dictate things, and that's honestly why I started with ruralvote.org, was because I was tired of saying, the party needs to be doing this. The party needs to be doing this. Well, at some point, I am the party. I need to be doing this. And if I'm not doing this, I can't complain about it. And so that's where I'm at.
Excellent. We have a few minutes left, and I just want to give you both a few minutes to wrap up, final thoughts, and let people know how they can get in touch with you, your website, especially people from Power Florida, which I'm a big fan of. And just some final thoughts. Let's start with you, Anna.
Yeah, too. And thanks again for having this conversation and bringing us all together. I really want to echo the points that were just made around. I am also part of the Democratic Party, so I have to do something about it. I can't just sit on Twitter and focus on my election and just complain about the larger ecosystem when I'm in a position when I can do something about the ecosystem. So even for me, as someone who's been involved as an organizer for about a decade now in Florida, like I always think about what else can I do better to add to the efforts and to not just complain about what I see as areas that we have to fix, but to actually try to fix it. So I'm being intentional and being a better partner, right, to the end goal, which is to not only elect stronger Democrats and win more seats, but to push for people-focused policies as well, so that we can establish long-term change that dismantles broken systems and puts into place institutions and structures that lift up people versus break them down. That gives more authority to everyday people compared to the business class. And so if you want to get involved with our work, I do encourage folks to always follow us online at Anna for Florida. 2 N's, all spelled out, at Anna for Florida is all of our social media handles, and annaforflorida.com is my website. And then for People Power for Florida, you can also follow us online at People Power FLA. And then our website is peoplepowerforflorida.com. And so please drop a couple of bucks if you can into these initiatives. But we really feel lucky to be in a place in Florida where we can lead the charge. And work with other partners who are also doing the same. So thanks again to the Netroots Nation for having us, and looking forward to continue to keep in touch as all of this good work continues to move forward.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much. JD, got about 2 minutes.
All right, I'll get my 2 minutes in. So I echo a lot of what Anna was saying. One thing I want to be clear about is that I'm not doing things to be anti-establishment. I'm here because I see gaps and I want to improve. Right now, there's 2 senators that is holding up a huge agenda that would benefit all my neighbors. And that's one of the things that I'm trying to do with ruralvote.org, is to improve democratic performance so we don't have to rely on 1 or 2 votes. And so we see the shifting of the population. By 2040, it's expected that 70% of the population is going to live in just 15 states. Now, that means that 70% of the Senate is going to be in smaller states, and a lot of those are more rural states. And so what are we doing as a party right now to prepare for that, when we already have the Supreme Court, the Electoral College, and the Senate all skewed towards the rural vote? And so that's what I'm working on. And you can follow me at JD Schulten on Twitter, pretty active on there. And then also ruralvote.org, it's in the name. And so we have some cool things coming up. And so please follow us. And if you have any questions, please reach out.
Thank you, JD. Thank you, Anna. Ricky Hurtado's website is Ricky Hurtado spelled out for NC, and he's on Twitter at Ricky Hurtado NC. I really want to thank Netroots for hosting us. I want to thank our panelists. I think you can tell why they inspire me and the work they do and how the change is going to happen. We all have a role in it, and just love that we're being inspired by all of you. Thank you so much, everybody who watched, and again, thank you, Netroots.